Katara is sailing through the Arctic waters when the vast northern water tribe wall comes into view, looming high and wide. Where her village had tiny igloos, here they have mighty palaces of ice. Whilst she knew the name of everyone in her village, here there are too many people to count. Where she was once the last waterbender, she is now no longer alone. Her people, the water tribe. One thing Avatar has always done really well is give a strong sense of place, world building, a sense of identity and culture and history for every settlement, city and nation. And I've talked about world building a ton on this channel because, well, I've got 3 books on it, including the latest, On Writing and World Building Volume 3. And look at how gorgeous this is. I'm so proud of it. It's the best volume yet. It's just been released, and with them, you can create your own worlds just as vivid as this. They've got all of the world building and the writing discussions we've had so far on this channel, but in better and more detail. And not only that, but you can also get my book, A Catalogue for the End of Humanity, where you can see me put all of that to work in my professionally published fiction, but also a ton of never seen before original fiction. And by the way, this is also fully illustrated. I am so in love with this book, and I'm so happy that I am able to share it with you. They are incredible stories, and I hope you enjoy them alongside my On Writing World Building series. I am so fortunate to be able to promote my own work on my own videos. Not everyone gets to do that, so thank you so much to everyone who does. Hope you enjoy them, and get a calendar for the year 2024. There's that as well, featuring all of the art in A Catalogue for the End of Humanity. It's incredible. The perfect Christmas gift, I say. It goes without saying, the water tribes don't have the resources of the Fire Nation, nor the population and land of the Earth Kingdom, instead living in the icy north and south. This does lead to an interesting world-building detail. The tribes were actually originally nomads. See, one of the reasons civilization settled down into fixed locations was agriculture. Staying in one location gave more consistent access to food and water. Harsh environments like the Arctic motivated people who lived there to migrate frequently, following the food sources. Indigenous peoples in Canada and Russia have done much the same thing for quite some time. It's why igloos were a part of life for them, not only because they're waterbenders, even though that might seem like the natural inclination. This isn't just because, oh, look, they're made of ice and they're waterbenders, right? I get why you'd think that, but actually it's because, well, there's not a huge amount of wood or metal in this sort of location, and they're also much easier and quicker to construct and take down for a population which might need to migrate. And that survival tactic is eventually adapted into the architecture of the southern and northern settlements, which are permanent. But more than that, these harsh environments keep the population low, and it's easier to survive in smaller, more local communities, like water tribes. And sure enough, their population is much smaller than the Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom. Even when all the men of the South head off to war, it's only a dozen boats or so. It tells us how small they really were. But small populations also make resource management with subsistence farming easier. There's flexibility and mobility. You're aware of everything that you have and everything you need and who you need to provide for. And social cohesion in these smaller groups, when people all know each other, can make living in these conditions easier too, something that we see in the cultures of the North, but especially the South. But it's also because of this we see a decentralized power structure. Those at the top, the chiefs, are not nearly as separate from those at the bottom, the workers, like we see in the Fire Nation between the Fire Lord and the average peasant, or the Earth King and the average peasant, who probably would never even see the Earth King in their entire lives. There's much less of a gap in wealth, power, and influence. It was only with Agna Kala, the huge city in the north, we finally got a name for it in the Avatar TTRPG, that we see how some of the water tribes there actually settled down, and we start to see a slightly steeper power structure. There's a palace, and there's more wealth and power and a bigger gap there. But like cities for many nomadic peoples, it didn't start out as a fixed settlement, not really, where everyone just suddenly lived and decided to stay there. It was probably more of a pilgrimage site, which people would regularly return to. We see in the Siege of the North that there's this spirit oasis described as, quote, a center for all spiritual energy in our land, this being the home of the moon and ocean spirits. So the site where the city is kind of centered around isn't just any spiritual site, like it is where they learned to use bending as an art, as something more sophisticated. Even if they got original waterbending from the lion turtles, yes, I know the difference. I don't want to see lots of comments about it. No. And this is actually kind of similar to what we saw with the city of Lhasa in Tibet. The traditionally nomadic Tibetan people would often make pilgrimages to the temples and sites there in the mountains. Icy place too, till eventually it became what it is now, this population hub. But you've got to think of bending in this sense as a resource, right? Like they find the moon and ocean here and they start to learn from them. And when they learn from them, those skills make it easier to survive and thrive. And suddenly you've got a geographical point which draws people in because it's easier to live there. Bending made it easier to defend themselves and to hunt and probably set up a place to live. So in a sense, the city grew around a resource, a center of knowledge maybe. But it was actually more than that, because they discovered a type of agriculture or livestock that they could keep there. And we learn about this from the Avatar cookbook, which I don't have yet, but I want it. Food is a hugely underestimated element of world building. You know, it tells us what resources are available, what it means to be rich, what it means to be poor, whether they cook communally or personally, who do they trade with and where do they get those resources from, how does food fit in with ritual and symbolism. There's so much there, and much like the other kind of nomadic tribes who live in relatively inhospitable areas, they rely a lot on high-calorie diets. They hunted seals, moose, whales, fish. There's a lot of kind of fat and dairy and meat. But more than that, we actually see that around Agnarkela, they're able to create a small amount of farming and agriculture. They farm fish and what they call Arctic hens, so they have some sort of sustainable food practice there. But we also know there was some degree of harvest in the summer around the Spirit Oasis, you know, where they could grow grass and blueberries. They could even grow satsumas and mushrooms and kale and a variety of flowers. The Spirit Oasis seems to kind of resist the changing of the seasons a bit, and it might apply to some of the surrounding area. So again, we've got kind of a geographical location that makes agriculture and livestock easier to keep and motivates centering a population there. I said we even know that they could grow satsumas inside the Spirit Oasis, you know, a tropical sweet fruit that they would consume on special occasions. So again, it was a rare thing, but it was possible. Even though that fruit is common in some regions of the Earth Kingdoms, you know, it's rarer and thus a special food to the Water Tribe that world building there with food. I mean, in our world, spices used to be extremely expensive, restricted to the wealthy, but now with kind of globalized trade, they're pretty commonplace. We can grow them most places. Food tells a story about wealth. But we can also see a lot of world building in how they thought about trade. Positioned on the coast with access to the most profitable parts of the Earth Kingdom, the Northern Water Tribe was able to export and import their way to prosperity. You know, that proximity and ability to easily travel is also part of the reason they were so much more successful than the Southern Water Tribe, which is isolated and has a long history of struggling economically, and we'll get to that in a bit. But this also put the Northern Water Tribe at the mercy of Earth Kingdom sanctions, and from time to time, like in the Northern Passage conflict, they ended up banning Northern Water Tribe goods, and because of that, without those kind of exports and without the ability to import very easily, their economy declined. One of the things globalized trade does is it allows larger populations to persist in places that wouldn't naturally support them. You can see this in islands all over the world. The ability to bring in ships and supplies every single day with regularity means that people can live there even though the environment doesn't naturally create enough calories and nutrients for the populations that's there. And we see this in the Northern Water Tribe, where throughout their history, their quality of life is kind of dependent on how tied they are to the Earth Kingdom and to the Fire Nation. So their population eventually kind of expands beyond what they can naturally support, and they suffer the consequences of that when things go really wrong. And this is one thing you can think about in your world, you know, which places in your world are kind of unnaturally supported, and how do they suffer when that support goes away because of war or sanctions or they're set off, you know, separated by disaster. Now, exactly what the Northern Water Tribe was exporting is a little up for debate, given it's not exactly resource rich, though we do find out later in the comics that the North and South have Oil. In the cookbook, we learned they imported flour, honey, rice, sugar, and wheat when they could afford it from the Earth Kingdom, something far more expensive in the South, which was much further away and had less manpower and fewer resources to trade with. They didn't seem to have that warmer region in the South either, which made farming and agriculture possible. There's no spirit oasis of their own down there. Interestingly, in Korra, we do see that both the North and South have the spirit portal around which a forest of sorts can seemingly grow, though we don't know to what degree they used any of this for agriculture or growing food. Seemingly it's a bit of a sacred place that people don't touch or don't go near, potentially if it's dangerous. And we see how much the South and the North suffered in what was called the Shang era, where basically the four nations refused to trade with each other except through a few select port cities. The North did a bit better because they had access to nearby cities like Bin Air, Jonduri, and Taku, which you can see on the map are a lot closer. The South did have Port Tugak, but it was much further away and facilitated a lot less trade. The South was kind of basically abandoned for this period, and that had some pretty terrible consequences. Beyond that, the North was shielded by this wall of the Northwest Earth Kingdom. It made them much more defensible. On the other hand, the powerful Fire Nation Navy had virtual dominion over the southern seas, cutting the South off from its allies and any resources it could have, any communication. Their location just made them so much more vulnerable. Now, one misconception a lot of people have is that there are two water tribes. There's the North and the South, and maybe the Foggy Swamp tribe. But that's not true. There are tons of them. It's not particularly clear in the series, but Katara and Sokka's is just one of many in the South. And while the North is a bit more united around Agna Kala, with one much larger tribe, there are still others littered throughout the North that are independent of them, maintaining their own traditions and beliefs. The South itself did not have that same economic and religious incentive to unite around a single city, but that also made them more vulnerable. You know, they're a lot more fractured. So it's no surprise that the South became the victim of the Fire Nation's raids. The North's centralization made them stronger and more coordinated, while the South was a scattered bunch of villages who couldn't coordinate as well to defend themselves. Because of the distance, lack of resource coordination, and lack of manpower that created between them. From a world-building perspective, the Fire Nation's hit-and-run tactics were kind of the perfect counter to this decentralized political structure, whereas the Fire Nation recognized they needed a strong central assault if they were to ever take on the North. Being a united front meant the North could just isolate themselves from the rest of the world, and that's what they did. It had been 86 years, I think, at the time of the series, that the North had basically sealed themselves away and not communicated with the South. However, the North saw a decline too. They had become too dependent on that international trade and were suddenly without it. And this stark contrast in wealth and power and influence between the South and the North is a recurring theme in Water Tribe history. People from the South would often leave in order to make a name for themselves, to make money and find opportunities they could not at home. This is something we see in the real world too. You've probably heard it called the brain drain. Where skilled workers from poorer countries move to richer countries in search of a better life, ironically inhibiting their home country from developing as quickly. Or maybe brain drain is a New Zealand term, I don't actually know, let me know down below, but like a lot of New Zealanders leave for Australia because there's higher pay and potentially more economic opportunities there. But we see this in a lot more extreme versions in, say, a lot of African economies where skilled workers end up going to America or to other European countries. But it's a complicated question because you can see why people would want to leave, but it does increase that gap that already exists between kind of the richer and poorer countries. That's already hard enough to close. And likewise, Southern Water Tribe workers would leave for the Earth Kingdom, Northern Water Tribe, Fire Nation, or once upon a time, I kid you not, they left for the Fifth Nation. Yeah, there was once a fifth nation in the world of Avatar. It was around for nearly a century. It was this coalition of benders and non-benders from all around the world, kind of a seafaring people who took over some coastal areas of the Earth Kingdom. They had their own distinct culture, and a lot of their population came from the southern water tribes seeking more opportunity. They were also known for their piracy from time to time, raiding the Earth Kingdom coasts, but they signed treaties with other nations under Avatar Yang Chen. You know, they even defeated the Earth Kingdom Navy on their own until Avatar Kyoshi put a stop to them. But if you look at it materialistically, they represented economic opportunity for people from the Southern Water Tribe. And we see this issue pop up again in The Legend of Korra and throughout the comics. Southern Water Tribe people migrate to Republic City in search of jobs and opportunity and work. One of my favorite moments in the comics is where Katara and Sokka meet Nutha, a girl they grew up with, suddenly working in the mines in the Earth Kingdom, this refinery in terrible, unsafe conditions. And when confronted, you know, why would you do this? She kind of says, pretty frankly, not everybody gets to buddy up with the Avatar and leave home. I'm not sure you're aware, but since you haven't been back, the Southern Water Tribe hasn't been doing all that well since the war ended. We're lucky to have found work. But perhaps the most interesting expression of all of this tension is in industrialization and globalization, two massively important forces in world building, especially when they happen to poorer countries like the Southern Water Tribe. All around the world today, we can see countries rich in natural resources, but without the infrastructure to exploit them. Or worse, they're sold off to foreign powers and companies, with the population not seeing any of that wealth. It's not uncommon for richer powers to come to these countries and say, hey, we will build all of this stuff for you, but you give us the rights to this thing. And the reality is that a lot of the time, the rights to that resource are actually more valuable in the long term. And sure enough, oil is discovered in the South. The North comes in and says, hey, we're going to help you exploit it and rebuild your cities given the war, but conflict breaks out between the various tribes of the South over whether this whole industrialization thing is kind of destroying their way of life. Katara kind of feels it is. See, globalization brings countries at very different technological levels into contact and often conflict with each other, especially in the case of colonization. Suddenly, the South is eating Northern Water Tribe cuisine. They're no longer building houses from ice. They're using other cultures' ways of doing things. And all of this is brought in with, hey, we're going to help you get back up off on your feet. And we're going to do it like this, this, and this, and this. The Northern Water Tribe even originally says, yeah, see, the South just isn't ready to take control of their oil reserves, so we'll take care of that for you until you can get back on your feet. And all of this is eerily reminiscent of a lot of corporate colonialism we can see today. Where the South used to be the scattered bunch of independent tribes, they're now meant to have elected Hakoda as chief of chiefs, not unlike the North. Decentralized peoples will often become more centralized as a way of meeting bigger threats on the international stage. The Māori tribes in New Zealand did the exact same thing. They elected a Māori king of sorts from their tribes as a way of meeting the British Queen on her level. Industrialization is often rapid, uncontrolled, and done with the money and influence of people who don't understand the local culture. And we see that in this story, how they meet that, how the South is forced to change and adapt, and it's so fast that they're not quite sure if they're doing it right. A lot of the global South faces many of the same challenges where they're trying to catch up with those richer countries who are pulling strings here and there while struggling to maintain their distinct culture and identity. However, increasing social and technological complexity with greater infrastructure, international cooperation does lead to political centralization. It's just kind of an inevitability of it. And that's what we see in Legend of Korra. The South, much like the North, starts to unite around kind of this one tribe and bigger cities. But throughout that shift, we do see how the other nations kind of took advantage of the South's weakness in the wake of the war. After the war, all of these cultures are coming crashing back together, intermingling and sharing things, but that sudden force from the outside world, that sudden cultural pressure, while from the outside it might just look like they're raising living standards and improving infrastructure for an impoverished nation, the people within can feel like they're losing a sense of their identity, you know, like that their world is growing growing and changing, but they're not quite sure how their original way of life fits into it. And this is, in a way, the origin of the Water Tribe Civil War we see in Korra. The North insists that the South should take back its heritage, part of which involves uniting with the North. They were, at one point, one tribe. And it's kind of this big brother, oh, you're so small and I'm so big and advanced and civilized and you should join us, because the North has always wanted to take back control of the South ever since they split all that time ago. The original split was over socio-cultural, religious differences, possibly over gender roles, with men being warriors and women being healers, which we see Katara struggling with when she goes to the North, but it meant that a large group left the North to go and live in the South. But, of course, exerting any real control over a distant country is actually pretty hard, especially for a smaller nation like the Northern Water Tribe. And we see this dynamic throughout all of Water Tribe history. While they flirt with political unification from time to time, it's usually in name only, and the few times the North actually tries to levy taxes or exercise any real control, it leads to resistance in the South. So instead, any control that sort of the North has over the South, it's mostly symbolic, until eventually the South wanted total independence. And we've seen this sort of thing 1,000 times before. Colonies which go off and are really far away and eventually want to split off and be their own thing. Other countries have kind of nominally recognized the authority of another country. You can see it in like Bhutan and Greenland, both of which happen to be far away, distant, icy places. But because of that distance, they still really maintain a high degree of sovereignty. So it's no surprise the North tries to use the South rebuilding itself after the war as a way to kind of re-exert control over the South, indirectly and directly. They sort of portray the Southern way of doing things, even the types of food they eat, as less advanced. Oh, you don't need to do that anymore. We're going to bring you into the first world. And it all culminates with the Water Tribe Civil War, because by this time, the South has really become its own distinct entity. They've had their own trials, struggles, and victories. We don't talk about it much, but they were the target of another genocide. The Air Nomads were not the only genocide in the series. The Fire Nation didn't just wipe out the Airbenders, but the Southern Waterbenders too, and the North did not help them, and that really does matter. These sorts of tragedies can destroy a people, yes, but it can also give the survivors a shared cultural narrative, and in this case, it's a shared cultural narrative for the South that doesn't include the North. It's one that galvanizes a separate identity, an identity that they come to want to protect and preserve. And we see that in their struggle to navigate an increasingly globalized world where their people leave for other jobs and other nations influencing them this way or that, an industry that changes how they're meant to live and rebuild. But one of the more interesting details in all of this mess is how industrialization and globalization affects the role of bending in Water Tribe society. Before industrialization, benders were the #1 way to build homes, probably hunt to fend their people, and suddenly electricity and power enabled non-benders to do many of the same things. And as a bender, Katara looks at this and goes, hey, our culture is being eroded. But Sokka, being a non-bender, looks at this as an opportunity, as evolution, as finally becoming equal, as progress. And I think one character sums this up pretty well. This is hard for you to understand, Katara, because you're a bender. That kind of power you possess just hasn't been available to us non-benders until now. And Katara fully admits she'd never thought of non-benders as not equal before, but it's kind of a reality. Because for Katara, all of this technological progress, all of this industrialization isn't just eroding their culture, but eroding her position and role in society. Fundamentally, what we see here is a kind of class change, where people born with certain privileges are losing those privileges as technology and infrastructure undermine the role they played. I know it's tempting to compare this to, say, royalty, but there's really not a direct comparison for us. Humans are not born as fundamentally different in ability as benders are to non-benders. Because a really important detail is world building isn't just creating a culture. It's how the people inside that culture perceive that culture. And this is the sort of stuff that I discuss in On Writing and World Building Volume 3. Because of course Katara wouldn't think about this sort of stuff. You know, the people with power and influence often justify what they have as it being deserved, or because they worked hard, or because they have different roles in society, or it's just luck of the draw and that's the way things are. The social and cultural role bending plays and the tension that might have with technology and class, well, we see those unfold with the Equalists in Legend of Korra. Suddenly, a class of people are more powerful and able than ever, and they want the power systems around them to reflect that. It's no wonder this tension is the sharpest in the Southern Water Tribe, where most of their benders were wiped out, leaving a huge population of non-benders trying to find new ways to rebuild and find opportunity for themselves. They rely on it more than other nations. Avatar has always been a favourite of mine for its world building. You can see the love and depth they put into it in every detail, and the books, by the way, about Kyoshi and Yang Chen, they go even deeper than the show. I actually do really enjoy them. They honestly stand on their own. Now, you might not realize this, but technically speaking, this video began around 5 years ago. Over 200 videos ago, I made a study in world building on the Earth Kingdom. It was the longest video I'd made at the time, and I went on to make the Fire Nation and the Air Nomads, and finally, now, the Water Tribes. I'd always get comments, you know, when are you doing the Water Tribes? When are you doing it? Well, here you go. It's kind of an end of an era, and if you have been around since the Earth Kingdom video, I would love to know that you've been here this long. That's crazy to me. If you love world building, then get my On Writing and World Building series. You do not need to have read Volumes 1 and Volume 2 to read Volume 3. They stand entirely on their own, but obviously they all work together. And talking about incredible sci-fi and fantasy, I would love to share a catalogue for the end of humanity with you. I want to say thank you to the tens of thousands. I think we're coming up on 100,000 books sold so far. That's honestly mind-blowing. I can't even begin to express how crazy that is for me personally, like just on a deeply personal level, how much that means to me. A catalogue for the end of humanity is the most personal thing I have ever written, and being able to have illustrations done for every one of my stories was just the most magical experience. And my On Writing World Building series has tons of Avatar references should you want them, with all of the writing and world building topics you could want and more. All at the link down below. There's also the calendar for 2024, which has all of the art and tons of quotes from the stories. I love it. Thank you so much. I know it's a lot. Stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future.